Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Charles Grant. I'm Director of the Centre for European Reform. Thank you for coming to our conference on Can Europe Be a Global Power? We've got 3 excellent panels today, plus a keynote address from Piotr Serafin, the Commissioner for the Budget. Let me just kick off with a couple of thoughts on what we may discuss today. I think the question of European power firstly relies on economic power above all else. So we have a session on that. Can we implement the Draghi and Letta reports? Is industrial policy the answer to Europe's problems? The way the EU is doing more and more industrial policy, is that the right way forward or not? Secondly, we need an energy transition. We need to invest a lot in the energy transition. We've got an excellent panel on that coming up too. And I think we can all see in the current time how we need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuel imports with the Iran crisis. Thirdly, we have a panel on enlargement as well. That's part of European power as well. Europe needs to enlarge and embrace the whole European continent, or most of it, and spread the rules-based global order across most of the continent. So that's very important as well, I think. Fourthly, we need to get closer to the British, because the British can contribute quite a lot in terms of defence and economics as well. And a closer UK-EU relationship is good for European power, in my view. Fifthly, defence capacity. Europe is finally spending a lot more on defence, thanks not only to the Germans but to others as well, which is highly desirable. So let's invest more in defence and build up European defence capacity. Fifthly, let's work with other middle powers, the ones that Mark Carney was talking about, to defend the rules-based global order. Not many middle powers need to get together and show that we sometimes feel in Europe we're on our own, where the Chinese and the Americans don't believe in the rules-based global order, but we forget that many other countries do believe in rules-based global order, and we had to work with them. And then basically, the final point is I think a lot of this is about strategic autonomy in economics, energy, technology, defence, foreign policy. Europe needs more strategic autonomy, and maybe we can discuss today some of the ways we can achieve that. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Elisabetta, who will moderate the first panel on asserting Europe's powers in electrostate. Elisabetta, over to you.
Very good, and just in time also, Adrian just got mic'd up. Thank you very much, Charles, for your introduction. Welcome everyone to the first panel of this conference. We're going to discuss how Europe can use electrification to its advantage, meaning how can it increase energy security and make its economy more competitive through this transformation. In short, how can Europe assert power as an electrostate? My name is Elisabetta Cornago. I'm Assistant Director at the CER here in Brussels, where I lead the work on energy and climate policy. And I have 4 great speakers with me on stage today. I have Adrian Hiel, Director of the Electrification Alliance, Frauke Thies, Director of Europe at Agora Energiewende, Paula Garcia, Head of the Renewables and Energy System Integration Unit at DG Energy at the Commission, and Pellerin-Carlin, Member of the European Parliament. Welcome all. I really look forward to this discussion. The sun is also shining, so that's an apt contextual point to talk about renewables. Just a few words really to set the scene. This panel's theme has become certainly more timely and pressing since February 28. We've seen the US and Israel attack Iran. The conflict has expanded to the region as Iran has blocked passage in the Strait of Hormuz, and this has jacked up oil and gas prices. Now, we're not yet at the price levels we saw in 2022 in the wake of Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine, but this does look like a bitter déjà vu for Europe, really. But electrification is the answer to fossil fuel dependency. And curbing Europe's dependency on imported fossil fuels requires electrifying processes that rely on them, and then shifting to clean electricity sources to power them then cleanly, without emissions. These changes amount to no less than an industrial revolution, affecting all sectors of the European economy: energy generation, manufacturing, be it in heavy industry, SMEs, buildings, transport. And so like any industrial revolution, really, this means that we are facing new opportunities, possibly, for innovation, manufacturing in clean tech, but we are also facing the sunset of legacy technologies like internal combustion engine cars, for instance, and thus resistance from some parts of the economy. The US had jumped on the electrification bandwagon with the Inflation Reduction Act, but is now backtracking under Trump. Instead, China is leading in these and clearly sees electrification as a key industrial strategy. In fact, we see two visions, I would say, of electrostates, the concept that we have in the title. We have two visions of electrostates shaping up. One is the consumer electrostate, which is an electricity-reliant state that replaces fossil fuels consumption with electricity consumption, domestically made and more efficient. The other is the producer electrostate, whose economy is centered in the production of everything necessary to power the electrification of the economy, from grid equipment, wind turbines, solar panels, heat pumps, EVs, you name it. I think these visions are not alternative, but I'd rather think of them as complementary, and in fact they reflect, I think, the maturity of the electrification journey. China is far ahead, it seems, while Europe is behind on electrification today, even while it still holds some strongholds in some of the manufacturing sectors that can power the electrified economy. So let's unpack all this over this panel discussion. You all have 6 or 7 minutes to share your initial thoughts. I will start to stare at you intently if you get too riled up with your speech, but really looking forward to this. So let me start with you, Frauke. So where does then Europe's electrification journey stand? You know, for industry, transport, buildings, there's a lot to electrify there.
Yes, indeed there is. Thanks a lot, Elisabetta. And maybe picking up on the crisis that you mentioned, just to dive into the electrification question, I think that the current situation we are in just shows again how much our fossil fuel dependence makes us vulnerable, and how electrification, and based on domestic clean sources, based on renewables primarily, is already helping us today to buffer that vulnerability. But as long as a very significant share of heating, transport, industry, and also power production is based on fossil fuels, we will be vulnerable. And whatever geopolitical shock happens will basically lead to price pressure, to industrial vulnerability, to instability in general. So the question is really, how can we speed all of this up? And will we in this crisis? I think last time when the Russian invasion in Ukraine started and happened, Europe was very much on a path with the Green Deal to move into one direction. Today, all of this looks a lot less certain. So will we be able to respond to this crisis in a concerted manner to actually structurally reduce that dependence on fossil fuels? Or will we just scramble to diversify supplies and just perpetuate this dependence? I think is a very big question currently happening. But coming to your question, Elisabetta, and I mentioned electrification renewables are already helping us significantly today. They very much are. But I think the truth is also that the rate of electrification is not quite, but almost stagnating in Europe. And that's quite shocking, considering the whole situation, considering how fast we're developing in the electricity sector, and how little use we're making of the potentials that clean generation offers us. And also considering, as you mentioned, Elisabetta, how China has overtaken Europe by far. So today we're looking at some 23.4% electrification across Europe. Adrian may correct me if we've moved a digit behind the comma or not, but basically far off track for the 32% by 2030 goal, which would require some 1.4 percentage points growth per year. I think the quickest growth that Europe has ever had was in 2007, when electrification picked up by 0.6 percentage points. So we would need twice the speed that we had in that best year yet. We're far behind that. And if we look into the different sectors and what's going on there, I think maybe starting with buildings, where we've seen at least a 7% percentage point increase since 2000. It is something. It's been quite an up and down journey, with markets speeding and then slowing again. Where we are today, we've seen quite stable pickup again in the UK and Germany, whereas we're basically seeing markets scattering and shrinking even in countries like Poland and France. And I think the picture is always the same. Where we have structural certainty, things move forward. Where there's a lot of uncertainty about subsidies, about the public perception of electrification altogether, the market is unstable or even shrinks. So I think one of the lessons also is, yes, subsidies can make a difference, but in order to really ensure stable growth, we also need those structural tools. The ETS2, a clear timeline for boiler phase-out, those elements in concert to make the transition in the building sector work, to make the transition in heating work. And frankly, if we look at the potentials there, I mean, even by 2030, the take-up of heat pumps could reduce several terawatt-hours of gas demand, and so much more if we look beyond that, creating very, very quick relief in a crisis situation. Then moving to industry, where despite all the potentials and despite all the goodwill, we've seen the electrification rate grow from some 30% in 2000 to, I would say, only 33.5 by 2024. In industry, we're looking at a sector where process heat is making the largest share of gas demand in particular, and where technically 90% of not yet electrified process heat could be electrified with technologies already available or expected to be available by 2035. And we've just last month published some case studies on where we are with process heat electrification from a business perspective. And the interesting piece is that in many places and for many applications, the electrification of process heat is already cost competitive, even today, and even as today's price ratio, especially for process heat under 80 degrees. A lot more would be possible if the price ratio, electricity, gas, was fixed. And what we often find also is that grid access is a key concern, the speed of grid access and obtaining the grid access in the first place. So those are the two levers, price ratio, addressing taxes and charges, but also addressing electrification, especially for industry in grid planning, in system adequacy assessments upfront to be ready to accommodate the demand that is there. Then if we look at transport, electrification rate is not going to surprise anyone, is lowest of all the sectors. We're looking at something like 2.3%. And that still sounds positive. If we look at road transport, it's even worse. It's under 1% that we have electrified in transport. So we're starting from a very low bar, even though, of course, we see the pickup of electric vehicles now moving ahead quickly, fortunately, in several European markets. And then, of course, underpinning all of this is the uptake of renewables, which is essential not only to meet the demand in electrification, but also to make sure that our prices are reliable, and reliable, I mean at a macroeconomic and annual basis. And that also means the more we can squeeze out gas off the power market and out of the price setting, the better prices will. If we look today at just the comparison of Spain having invested a lot in renewables and having a lot of hours today where gas is no longer setting the price, and compare that with Italy, where this development has not taken place at that scale, and look at the price impact that Italy is suffering in a crisis situation like today. Elisabetta is looking at me, so I gather that I need to come to a close, which is a pity because I would like to just say maybe a small minute, not more,
We can come
on
back
the
to it.
relevant. Okay,
over
we
the
will come.
Q&A. Thank you so much.
Just to plug, I want to talk about market stability and signal stability, especially of the ETS and the energy market, which
Yeah,
is so essential underpinning.
I think we definitely need to come back to the ETS because as the centerpiece of European climate policy, I think it being under attack certainly would have an impact on electrification. So I would be keen to hear from all of you what you make of that. So we'll make sure to touch upon that after your intro remarks. Thanks so much for setting the scene, Frauke. Thomas, so Frauke reminded us that dependency on imported fossil fuels is a vulnerability for European consumers and industry specifically. So how can we break this vicious circle, really? How can we break free from this dependency and thus from being impacted time and again from the vulnerability to price spikes on the gas front particularly?
Thank you very much, Elisabetta. I think it's just like when you have a disease. You first need to make sure that you have the good diagnosis before you can administrate the good, or at least one of the good predicament. The analysis, the starting point should be what happened. And what happened is that the European industry has invested in its production process for decades, assuming that we will always have an access to unlimited amount of cheap and reliable Russian gas. That has been the mainstream view in the EU from essentially Ostpolitik, so 70s, 80s, until, as a mainstream view in the EU, 2022. Obviously, not everybody thought that way. But let's remember that when Nord Stream 1 was built, it was not only something that you did not push against, it was even a project of common European interest. When Nord Stream 2 came out, I remember vividly because I was a researcher at the time, one of the first pieces that I wrote was about how unrealistic the Gazprom expectations on EU gas consumptions were, because Russia was assuming, or rather manufacturing, let's say, very original foresight, telling that Europe, by 2015, will be consuming 550 BCM of gas, which is many, many times more than what we actually did, in order to legitimize the construction of Nord Stream 2. And I remember vividly the European divide on Nord Stream 2. A good friend of mine, who happens to be Polish, said in 2015 that the only thing that gets a worse press in Poland than Nord Stream 2 is ISIS, which, that's where it put. Nonetheless, many member states continued forward with Russian gas, even after the beginning of the war in Donbass, even after the annexation of Crimea. Germany is obviously the most obvious member state there, but let's not forget Austria. Let's not forget even my own country, France. The French government supported ENGIE, which is historically a French gas company. The main shareholder of ENGIE is the French state, and ENGIE was a 10% shareholder in Nord Stream 2. So that also means that a lot of the investments that we have today, as you know, in this industry, it's always like long cycles. So a lot of the investments that are producing in 26 were made with an idea of a gas price that was around 10 to 20 euros per megawatt hour. 10 to 20 euros per megawatt hour, that's kind of the average price we had for decades. We entered a new world in the summer of 2021. I insist on this. This is before the full-scale invasion. In the summer of 2021, Gazprom decreased its gas supply to Europe, especially on the spot market. And then there was the full-scale invasion. Putin lost the battle for Kyiv. And from April 22, he entered the war that is currently waging against us, Europeans, that long attritional war. And his theory of victory is AfD in power in Germany, Bardella in power in France, and therefore Franco-German betrayal of Eastern Europe and Ukraine. That's where Putin wants to go. And for him, cheap Russian gas is still one key asset. He has weaponized our energy dependence. Now we live in a world without Russian gas, with very small amounts of Russian gas, and hopefully by September 2027 with 0 molecule of Russian gas. And in that world, we have a gas price in Europe that ranges from 25 euros per megawatt hour at the lower end. I insist on that. The lower end today is higher than the highest end of the past. And it can go up to 50 euros today, but also up to 100. Let's just pray that there is no nuclear accident in Japan, that there is no drought in Brazil, that there is no cold winter in China, because that will push the energy price again, and therefore the gas price in Europe, because we now rely on energy. That to me is important because a lot of the lobbying that has been doing in Brussels is saying, oh, the industry is struggling because of the Green Deal. No. Like the European industry is struggling for many reasons. Some of them are not related to energy, like the Trump tariff have a bigger impact than electrification when it comes to the European car industry. Just look at Stellantis that had to devalue its North American assets by 6 billion euros recently. The main problem that we have is we need to live with an expensive gas. So now we actually have two options. The option number one, which is the one supported by AfD, is a coherent one. It is fossil fuel serfdom. They don't care about European freedom, and they have a nostalgia for fossil fuels. They are, making LinkedIn post with a picture of the internal combustion engine. They are praising the gas boiler. And that nostalgia makes sense if you are ready to pay the cost. As we Europeans do not have access to fossil fuels, we import more than 90% of our gas and 97% of our oil. If you want fossil fuel nostalgia, the cost is European freedom. It is transforming the free nation states of Europe into the serfs and the vassals of an oil and gas giant. That's essentially what Viktor Orbán has done in Hungary. Hungary is no longer a free country, not only because Orbán is oppressing his own people, but also because there is no geopolitical freedom of the Hungarian government because it is controlled by Russia. That's a Korean plan. If you don't believe in freedom and you believe that fossil fuels are the future, then go the Orbán way and the AfD way. The cost of that will not only be freedom, but it will also be macroeconomic rationality. We are not living through the first oil and gas shock in our history. From a Western European perspective, at least, we had one in 73, in 79, in 1990, in 2008, in 2014, in 2021, in 2022, and in 2026. Would be great at some point, by the way, to realize the pattern. And to realize that some of the things that we have not done in the past are stuff that we need to do now, but also that some of the things that we did do in the past actually help us. Like, if today we have a lot of wind power, it's because the Danes invested a lot in R&D in the 70s and the 80s. If today the number one power source in Europe is nuclear, is because historically in the 70s, the French, the Swedes, also the Germans in the 70s did invest in a nuclear fleet that is actually very helpful to provide homegrown, decarbonized electricity. As long as we rely on oil and gas, we will have those shocks again and again. I don't think there is any central banker in the room, but one thing we can all do to make a central banking job easier is to get out of fossil fuels. Because today our central banks have to choose. The increase in oil and gas prices is likely to provoke a risk of a recession in Europe and also inflation. And as a central banker, you would need either to increase the interest rate to protect from inflation, but therefore you will create a recession with millions of jobs being destroyed, with industry closing and never reopening. Or you decrease the interest rate to support the industry, to support its investment, but then what about inflation coming from the oil and gas price? Option two.
Briefly.
Yeah. I mean, the option two is simpler, like it's everything Frauke talked about. It's what I would call electro-democracy. If you believe in freedom, you need electrification. This is just the matter of life, access to resource, and technologies in the 21st century in Europe. Putin, Trump, Ayatollah Khamenei, they can all cut our access to oil and gas. But none of them has the power to stop the sun from shining here in Brussels or the wind from blowing in Hamburg. So that's clearly the way forward. I would also, for some member states, that mix of renewables will also include nuclear, but that's obviously a national prerogative. And we need to find a way to have a European energy policy that allows Germany and Austria and others to have a successful clean energy transition with that nuclear, while also allowing Sweden, Slovakia, and France to have a successful clean energy transition with nuclear, because that is the national prerogative. So the policies we need for that are first implementation of everything we've agreed upon, ETS, CO2 for cars. We need more investment. That's where social leasing, that's where the building renovation law comes in. And final point, we need a coalition. We need a political coalition where we say all the energy files should not be negotiated in splendid isolation. We need to have one single package. We need to discuss electricity grids, automotive package, ETS, governance regulation, with all of that under one roof, one architecture, with one single coalition, and the only coalition that can deliver that here and now is the von der Leyen coalition. The Social Democrats, my group, but the Greens, Renew, EPP, and ECR.
And I think we'll come back also to the, how up to speed, I suppose, the policy architecture that's under discussion is once we hear from Paula. But first, I wanted to move to Adrian. So Thomas was speaking about, I guess, the macroeconomic importance of electrification as well, and really the word of the year is competitiveness. So how does the electrification of industry tie to competitiveness for European manufacturing? How can these sectors use this transformation to their advantage? You've worked on a very, I think, clever way of picturing the several innovations that are part of electrification. So why don't you talk us through that?
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks very much for having me, by the way. It's a very incredibly timely event, and we're blessed with a lovely bit of sunshine to bring it in. And it's worth noting that this morning, thanks to the sunshine, electricity prices in Belgium, France, Germany, the Netherlands, this morning was about minus 400 euros a megawatt hour. So when people tell you electricity is too expensive to electrify, that's not true. What it is it's a reflection of the fact that we have radically transformed our electrical system in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 4 years, right? And the challenge in front of us now is using that electricity in a way that reflects the system that we've built, right? And that is that there are periods when electricity is really, really cheap, and there are other periods when it's quite expensive. And we need to focus our attentions on getting that abundant, cheap, reliable energy into our buildings and our transport and our industry. It's a very different challenge from the sort of Renewables Energy Directive and Energy Efficiency Directive that we've had in the past. Right? We succeeded. Our electricity is 73% clean now. Right? We've done really, really well, and we should be proud of ourselves. But we need to adapt then to the next stage. So that's why I came up with this electrification staircase. It was myself, it was Michael Liebreich, Dr. Sylvia Mededu from Schneider Electric, and Rob Thomas from the Regulatory Assistance Project. And what we've done here is lay out when things are going to electrify. And this is a global view, it's not EU specific, right? And so when industry comes into play, you'll see things on the bottom rungs. These are things that are competitive now, can be done now, and their rollout varies in different parts of the globe depending on those particular electricity mixes. So for industries, say in row B, all of that stuff technologically very easy to do. It's not a problem.
Why don't you give us some examples? Because I think the readability for some at the back may be tricky.
Fair enough. Yeah. So in terms of industries, you've got industrial food and bev preparation. You've got things like obviously trains and vans, textile manufacturing, brewing. About half of our gas use in industry can be found on those bottom three rungs. So the potential is enormous. The technology is there to do it. What we need is the pricing to make sure that it's competitive. The pressure to make it happen, however, because companies do take a long-term view, they've had investments based, as Thomas says, on long-term cheap Russian gas. Industries like textiles here, for example, that are global industries, they're competing against industries in other places. They're going to be under incredibly fierce pressure in the coming years as their competitors in other places electrify, notably anyone based in China, because, as Frauke said, their rate of electrification is much higher. So for them, this electrification becomes an existential crisis. If they don't electrify, they're going to be at a serious disadvantage compared to their international competitors. For other industries like paper drying, like brewing and spirits, their competition tends to be much closer to home, companies with a similar energy mix or energy availability, if you like. So, paper plant, a cardboard paper plant is only going to compete against other cardboard plants within 300 kilometers. So for them, it's much more an opportunity to have an economic advantage over their competitors as opposed to reacting to an existential threat. One really key point that I want to drive home, and I know we're talking about industry here, but it's the fact that this stuff is all interrelated. As we electrify most of these things and most of our economy over the next 15 years, what we do in one sector, if that's houses or transport, has a direct impact on what we do in industry. So this morning, prices are at minus 400 euros per megawatt hour. It's incredibly cheap. What we're lacking is a huge amount of EVs and heat pumps in homes to absorb that electricity and use it cheaply, right? And what we're also lacking is those low-temperature industrial processes where they can say, yep, put on a batch of beer we're brewing now, and it's not going to cost us a cent. And that's really, really important for their competitiveness and for households, but it's also really, really important for the more energy-intensive industries, like steel, like aluminum, like glass. They don't have that flexibility, right? You're not going to turn off a glass furnace for 2 hours because the electricity is really expensive. But what we need to do is bring in the EVs and the heat pumps so that their consumption goes up when electricity is cheap, but it turns off when the electricity is expensive. This is a really, really fundamental point. We need to increase electricity consumption without increasing the peaks, because that's where the cost is and that's where the gas is. Right? That's what makes those peaks expensive. It's the gas that we use. And now, Acer had a report out on Monday. Only 13.8% of our electricity in Europe is based on gas. It's incredibly low. What we haven't done is we haven't changed our consumption to reflect that. So while our gas consumption in power has never been lower, the number of hours where gas sets the price has gone up from 2024 to 2025. Right? This is a very clear failure of our society as a whole to adapt our consumption. So the only thing I would close on is just to reiterate that if we want to protect those energy-intensive industries, those ones that don't have the flexibility, we need to, start planning on their electrification now, because it's a multi-year process to change a massive production facility. It's not something that we do when the conditions are right. We have to anticipate those conditions. And the other thing is we have to make sure those conditions are there by continuing full force on our efforts to electrify our homes and our transport so that we get that flexible demand. And actually, the one other thing I would say, just given the current the fossil fuel crisis, go out and get solar panels yourselves, like this week. It's really easy. It doesn't take any time at all. They'll pay for themselves in like 2 or 3 years, I'd say, depending on what happens with gas prices. The same with heat pumps. This is something we can all do, and it's a small thing, but the cumulative impact is if we want to protect households in Europe, that's the way we do it fundamentally. It's that structural shift. So by all means, if you want any advice on that, I'm happy to help. And I will leave it there at 7 minutes and 21 seconds.
Excellent timing. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. And I invite all of you to look up the electrification staircase and look into the details of this great conceptual work. Paula, let's come to the policy. What EU policies do we need to accelerate electrification? As we said, we are a bit lagging behind across sectors. And can electrification get us 2 birds with 1 stone, actually, meaning lower energy prices and energy security? So how do we get there, policy-wise? Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, good morning to everybody, and thanks also for having me. And I think also listening to the other panelists, it's clear that there is a great deal that is happening around us, but also some deja vu that we can see from previous crises. But still, I would put it with a positive spin that we are in a better place, thanks also to the implementation of what we have been doing since the previous crisis. So taking maybe a step back, if we then look at, all the advantages that we have been collectively mentioning about electrification, we can see that definitely it ticks all the boxes of what we need to do today, being on security of supply, you were mentioning, also on competitiveness. There is also, of course, the link to energy prices, affordability, the possibility for citizens to shelter themselves from many of the volatility that is happening. But still, going a bit deeper, I think it's really very important that we communicate on this aspect of the dependency on fossil fuels and how that impacts the volatility that end consumers see, because I think there is a lot that has to do really with communicating what is happening. There is a second element definitely about innovation, and I think it was hinted also in previous interventions. So with electrification, we can bring much more efficiency into the system. There were examples on heat pumps, on electric vehicles. They are really much more efficient than the alternatives, and this makes economic sense. So that's also another very important argument. And then, of course, what we also see is that for many of these, we have the tools at hand. It's not that there are no tools available, but we are missing some key conditions. There is, of course, the question of electricity-based solutions that have the possibility to be cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives, but still there are barriers standing on their way. There is also the element of network tariffs that need to be designed in a way that really contributes to this shift. So besides the good reasons, let's say, to step up, we also need to see how to bring down the barriers. And I think that's really where EU policy comes in. And what we see as key barriers that were identified very clearly in all the preparatory process that we have done for the Electrification Action Plan has to do quite a lot on also the systemic approach. I mean, we need to look at the supply side, we need to look at the demand side as well, but also at flexibility. It was mentioned on negative prices. That signals that there is a lot, very strong renewables generation, which is very positive, is really what we wanted. But at the same time, we see that flexibility is lacking, storage is lacking. We also see at the interface that we need to accelerate the grids. That's also a very important element, and it was also mentioned. And then, of course, we need to zoom into the different demand sectors and look at all of them and do it also in parallel so that we create also this, let's say, systemic change that is needed. But maybe stopping into each of these a little bit, for taxation and for the components of the different elements of the energy price, there we have already been putting the finger on these different components already with the action plan for affordable energy. And there we have seen really already progress in some member states, but not as much progress as we would like, because we see that still overall taxation structures really favor fossil fuels. And that is something very fundamental that is really in the hands of member states to be able to tackle in different ways, of course. There are different situations, different barriers, but still is something that is really a precondition, let's say, for moving into the direction of increased electrification, but also on making the electrification solutions more attractive and also bringing down energy prices. So this is something really that is very fundamental. We also need to make sure that if we increase demand for electricity, that of course supply follows. so that we keep also the market in balance and we don't end up having also an increase in energy prices. So everything that has to do with clean supply going into the system, with permitting, with predictability of that supply coming in is really very important. But then if we look more closely into the system, what we see is the elements that we were mentioning, so negative prices that are both a red flag, but also, of course, an opportunity, because we have there low energy prices, which is what we are looking for, but we need to translate that and bring that to the end consumers. So here, grid's essential, but also storage flexibility. There is a lot that needs to be done still on that front to be able to bring the benefits of more clean energy, more renewables to the end consumers in terms of prices. We have, of course, also the interface, what we are doing with the European grids package that is now in negotiation. That's also a very important policy that we need to accelerate and to bring to an ambitious result. And then, of course, we also have solutions that are already in legislation, but we need to implement much more forcefully, for instance, contractual solutions, such as contracts for difference or power purchase agreement that really can bring also the benefits again to the end consumers, but also protect them from the volatility of the electricity market, but also of the gas imports. So on both ends you have volatility. And with long-term contracts, then you can really bring those benefits, including to industry, so that they can really benefit from more protection from the price spikes, and at the same time they also give certainty to the developers as well, so that they invest. And this connects as well to the aspect of competitiveness. So here, I think, the positive message is that indeed we have already a lot now, much more than several years ago. The solutions are also there. We also have some very positive experiences, for instance, with the pilot auction that we had for heat decarbonization. That is also something that we could build on. And then it was also mentioned the link to buildings, and there as well, of course, an element that we are looking at together with the Electrification Action Plan is also heating and cooling. There are also elements there to tap on, being direct renewable heat sources, or really how to bring more electrification also into the heating and cooling sector. So there as well is an area that requires quite some attention on the policy side.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for this initial round of thoughts. I have a lot of follow-up questions, of course, but first I also wanted to maybe have a show of hands from the audience to have a sense of how many questions we have in the room. No? I will break the ice, but why don't you start thinking about questions on your end? Otherwise, I will have to keep on talking for a very long time. One thing that was mentioned, both from Adrian and then Paula, was look at this beautiful sunny day. Negative prices out there on electricity markets. First of all, why don't one of you break it down, perhaps for the non-energy nerds in the room? That would be ideal. And then, how can we bring the benefits then of cheap renewables being plentiful in the system on the bills of energy consumers? Because we know that today that can actually be feasible through some of the contractual innovations that we see out there for larger, perhaps industrial players. They can go and contract directly their energy supply with the renewable energy producers and get a lower price locked in for a long time. That's great. But me as an individual consumer, even though I am an energy nerd, I have a harder time doing that. We can talk about the complexities. But so how can we make it really visible and tangible, a price reduction in bills through renewables? What is missing there? So first of all, what are negative prices for the people? And secondly, how to make that a reality? And then, of course, there's more on my mind, but I wanted to follow up on that. And do catch my eye if you want to also come in on those elements, of course, or react to anything that the others said initially.
I'm happy to take that on. So in terms of what are negative prices, essentially you've got a surplus in the market, right? We're generating more electricity than we can use, is the really fundamental thing. And this is a structural shift. This is going to happen all the time. It's happening more and more every year. We've seen the variability within the day. The prices go up and down a lot. It is trickling through to consumers, not as fast as we want and not as fast as it should have been, because much of this was included in the Clean Energy for All package in 2009 that hasn't been implemented in a lot of countries. And there's enabling things like smart meters. You have to have a smart meter to be able to use dynamic tariffs. And the rollout of those smart meters has been very, very different in different member states. Germany, notably, is incredibly slow on this, and it's costing them an absolute fortune. But the good news is, like say here in Belgium, we've seen in the last month 3 major electricity retailers come out with time of use tariffs. So that's a simplified sort of thing that says, look, on Sundays, you're going to get free electricity, and you can count on that. And during the week, it's going to be more expensive in the morning and in the evening, but it's going to be cheaper during the day, and it's going to be cheaper at night. And so the goal there is really just to make sure that people plug in their car overnight instead of plugging it in at 6 p.m. And when they put on their washing machine and their dishwasher, they put it on a timer so it starts at 11 o'clock at night. Right? People save money, and the impact on the grid goes down significantly because we're using much more of those renewables instead of exacerbating the peak. Beyond that, the single biggest thing then is taxation, which is what Paula said. That's exclusively a member state competency, and we see the divide in Europe, especially right now with this fossil fuel crisis. You've got a number of countries that are completely insulated from the increase in gas, right? The Nordics, Iberian Peninsula, France, it really doesn't affect the electricity price there at all. And then you've got other countries, especially Italy, Austria, Germany, and much of Eastern Europe, where they're very, very heavily influenced by that increase in gas. And this is a reflection of the fact that a lot of countries have put in the smart meters, and they've put in the dynamic tariffs, and they've incentivized people to electrify in renewables to protect their populations. These are choices that countries have made and can still make to protect their populations moving forward the next time this happens.
Thank you. Paula, did you want to add anything on that? Otherwise, I was...
Well, I think the implementation point is really very important, and it's also what we had in mind with the Citizens' Energy Package of last week, also to give a push to implementation. And then you need to, on the one hand, of course, bring the technologies, but they are available. So what is hampering a lot their use and the benefits is really this famous electricity-gas price ratio, because then otherwise they would not be sufficiently attractive. Then you say, okay, the contracts that I was mentioning maybe for citizens are not that relevant, but the tariffs they are. And then for storage, I would say also, besides, the electric vehicle, besides the heat pump, home storage is also more and more accessible, easily combined with other solutions, solar, heat pumps, etc. And that really needs to be rolled over, because it would also bring these benefits to citizens.
Mm-hmm. Frauke, you wanted to come in, and then Thomas?
Yeah, very largely agree with what's been said. I'm not as positive on negative prices as such, because something is wrong with the market if we are supporting generators to feed in power when prices are already negative. And that's a sign, frankly, of member states not yet having implemented the adjustments to, in particular, the renewable support and the market design since the last crisis. Because technically, we don't need that. And that's the beauty of renewables in particular, that if there is oversupply, they can be switched off, and that is not a disaster either. But what is maybe not a disaster, but a huge lost opportunity is that we don't use the flexibility and the capacities that we have to make use of that cheap power when it is there. Maybe not at negative prices, but at very low prices, or at prices of 0. And that is, as you mentioned, it's demand-side flexibility, where, by the way, especially if we look at electrification of heat, the potential is extremely interesting, because it does not really matter whether you start heating your home in the winter at 5 before you get home, or whether you heat it at 3:30, if that's when the sun is shining and producing, especially if you have a well-insulated home, or a heat boiler that works with your heat pump, to be flexible and adjust to demand. So what I'm saying is that much of the electrified potential also has the potential to act very flexibly to price shifts. And then, of course, storage, and a big one, interconnection grids. Because very often the sun is shining in one area and at that moment not in another. The wind is blowing in one part of Europe and maybe weaker in another part. Interconnection can really help us chip into those benefits. And it will automatically level out much of those in the extreme negative prices, because someone else will happily use that power and pay for it. So it's really that bundle of measures that we need. And then to conclude, we have had a lot of conversation about, is our market design the right one or is it not? It is about implementing all the elements that we have, which were further improved after the last crisis or during the last crisis, to make sure that basically renewables have both stable investment conditions but also don't over-benefit when prices shoot through the roof. So those need to be implemented. But those price signals that the market is giving us are absolutely essential to steer the investments into flexibility, into using power when it's there. It is very important, and what our market does is basically allocating whatever is cheapest at whatever moment to be used. I think generally we are at this moment observing a conversation where everything's put into question, where our market design, fortunately, it seems that that debate is now off the table and is no longer put into question fundamentally. But the same for the emissions trading scheme. And linking back to the crisis situation we now have. What better tool is there than an instrument that incentivizes to get out of fossil fuels? And that's what the ETS has done structurally over all the years, to get out of fossil fuels and invest in technologies that are independent of fossil fuels. And on top of that, the ETS is generating revenues that can and should be invested exactly to accelerate that change. It's money that is not lost. It's money that's going back into the economy to help us make that change. So it seems completely counterintuitive to be putting this into question, especially in the moment of crisis. And then last point I want to make on that is also a, I think, very interesting buffering aspect in the near term that is very often overlooked. Because at this moment, we see fossil prices going up. What does that mean? It means that fossil-fueled industrial demand is currently going down, whether we like it or not. It's painful because they are fossil fuel dependent. What that also does is emissions prices are going down because the demand for emissions certificate is lower. So since the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, emissions certificates prices have gone down 18%, giving us a buffer, a stabilizing effect for prices altogether, which I think is a very interesting, also short-term buffering measure alongside the very structural buffering that the emissions trading offers us, which frankly is not even used sufficiently yet, especially the reinvestment part into the economy and into the transformation. But overall, we have a tool here that is really helping us drive away from this very risky dependence that we still have.
Thank you. There are several follow-ups that I have. Again, can you catch my eye if you have questions? Everybody's very quiet. Okay, we have three. So,
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, why don't I let you also respond, and then I will come to the audience. We have several questions at the front. Thank you, Jordan. Yeah.
So first, fully agree with everything that Frauke says. I think it's irresponsible for politicians to create unpredictability in Europe. The biggest unique selling point, the biggest added value that we can have as politicians for the competitiveness of the EU economy now is to be a beacon of predictability, especially as the US is going crazy in all sorts of ways. We need to be more than ever predictable. Coming back to the issue of how do we transform solar radiation into cheap electricity, one thing we absolutely need to address are solutions that do not increase the grid cost. The generation of electricity just accounts for a tiny percentage of the final bill. Grid cost, depending on the places, but in many instances, grid costs are actually higher than the cost of the generation of the electricity. And so therefore, I'm looking at areas where we can consume that electricity without increasing the grid. And so that means essentially having a very micro and granular approach to make sure that we can co-locate supply and demand. How can we do that? If you put a rooftop solar panel on a service building, think, for instance, about an elderly care facility, where you've got a lot of very low-income people that come there and work, cleaning ladies, caretakers, all of that. If those caretakers are allowed to use an electric car through the European social leasing scheme that we as Social Democrats are pushing, then the electric car comes at, 8 a.m. In the morning at the elderly care facility, and the facility can directly put that electricity, that solar electricity, directly into the cars of the employees, which is a way to increase the purchasing power of the employees, and therefore that's also, as an employer, something that you can give, not only a wage, obviously, as a Social Democrat, I'm in favor of increasing wages also, but also something where you get free electricity and a free charge. What's the impact on the grid cost? Zero. Like you need like a few meters of copper to connect the solar panels with the charging points for the car. Final point is really on one of the missing pieces, I think, of our discussion so far is heat storage. We can do a lot because it's much easier to store heat than to store electricity. I've worked a little on solar thermal, but obviously if you have solar PV plus a heat pump, it's kind of the same thing in the end. Just for you to understand the magnitude of what heat storage can achieve. In 2018, in Canada, they managed to heat an entire block of those big Canadian houses, like 200, 300 square meters per person, through the Canadian Midwest winter. We're talking minus 30, minus 40 Celsius degree. They did that only with solar heat plus heat storage throughout the year, because they managed to store the heat in the summer and use that in the winter. I'm not advocating that we do that everywhere. It's just for us to understand the role that heat storage can play. And so if we have that, then that is definitely a game changer, because anytime we've got a lot of sun, we can have heat pumps, for instance, running at full capacity, and some of that heat being used when it's useful, but also some of that heat being stored for hours, days, weeks, even months, depending on what we actually need.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, a pointer to the fact that technology is available. It's a matter of how can we make sure that it's picked up, and so removing the barriers that are there to its adoption. I think that we had a couple of questions on this side and then on the other as well.
Thank you. Vlad Kravtsov, 24th Channel, Ukraine. I wanted to ask perhaps Ms. Garcia or Mr. Pellerin-Carlin. One question is that as we can see, against the backdrop of the crisis on the Middle East and crisis with oil supplies in the world, there has been a talk in Europe that maybe the European Union should start to, it's a talk of possible resumption of Russian oil, notably via the Druzhba pipeline. So does the EU really intend to resume imports of Russian oil, and what extent might this play into the Kremlin's hands and influence the war in Ukraine? And one more question is that why the European Commission is so interested in repairing the Druzhba pipeline in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me collect a couple of questions. I think there was another one next to yeah, thank you.
Alkım Özkazanç from the Turkish Industry and Business Association. My question will be actually directed to all participants. I would like to actually hear more about your takes on policies that directly aim to actually incorporate the households or other consumers into the energy market, for example, by incentivizing them to install their own energy producing equipment like solar panels, and then allowing them to basically sell the excess amount of energy back to the market. So what do you think that the main risks and opportunities will be if such an approach will be pursued? And do you think that it will be really able to make a notable change with respect to solving some of the energy crisis that Europe is currently facing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me actually gather also yeah, I think there was Anton, did I also see? And one at the back, and then I come back to the speakers.
Anton Spisek from the Center for European Reform. Thank you very much for all your remarks, really fascinating. Two questions. One is on the politics of the climate transition. It seems to me there's a real backlash against a lot of the ideas you've talked about. So how do we think of a positive case for all of this? If you're a politician and you're facing the threat of a far right getting into government, how do you build that kind of positive case that it's not only about reducing dependence, but it's also about something different? Do you have any ideas on that? And then the second question is about China. And it seems to me we are a really interesting moment in the EU policy debate on China's contribution to European electrification efforts, where on the one hand, Chinese industrial policy and the spillovers from that have led to the abundance of very cheap net zero technologies. In many cases, European consumers are really benefiting from that. And on the other, there's a real push to protect European producers of those technologies, and we've just seen that last week through the Industrial Accelerator Act. So how should policymakers think about that kind of tension between consumer and producer interests? And is there sort of an equilibrium in this space that is beneficial to both?
Great questions, and I think I will pick up the final one from the gentleman there and then come back to speakers.
Yes, Gregor Erbach, European Parliament Research Service. I'd be interested in your view on bidding zones in the electricity market. Will close alignment of the bidding zones with physical grid constraints, as in Sweden, enable more economically efficient electrification? Or do you see benefits to larger bidding zones like in Germany with a uniform price across a larger geographical area?
Thank you very much. I will challenge actually the speakers to explain bidding zones in a way that's understandable to a non-energy nerd. Let me start with Thomas on the politics, both on, should Europe think about starting imports of oil and gas as well, right? That has also been voiced by the Belgian Prime Minister. Yeah. What about that? How about we start giving more power to the person that's been blackmailing us? How does that sound?
Not only blackmailing.
Mm-hmm. And then the other point was about the backlash more broadly to the Green Deal. So why don't you address those?
So I was the Social Democratic lead for the Russian gas regulation. And the two words I heard most in the mouth of all the negotiators, regardless of their political group, was, quote, never again. So let me be clear. As long as I'm an MEP, and to be honest, as long as I'm alive, I will do everything that I can to make sure that we never again import a single molecule of Russian oil or gas. For gas, we have that regulation. Paula can do whatever the F he wants to say. He can say whatever he wants. He's a free man in a free country. He doesn't have the votes. So Paula belongs to a political group called the ECR. I urge you to look at the response coming from another member of the European Parliament from the ECR, from the same political group, Gerhard Kos, who is from Latvia. He made a tweet responding to Paula, and I 100% agree with everything that my ECR colleague said, which is not a sentence I say often as a social democrat, to be clear. So you can rest assured, on gas, never again we will import. On oil, we still need to adopt a regulation there. My understanding is that the Commission will propose that regulation in the middle of April, and we have the votes, and that's the way it works in a democracy. There is, thank God, a lot of Central Eastern European in Parliament, and I don't need to lecture a Finn or an Estonian or a Pole on the Russian threat. They understand that in their bones. I sometimes need to have a careful discussion with my French colleagues and also with my German colleagues from time to time. But with the way that Parliament works, I can assure you that we have a majority, not only to support Ukraine as long as it takes, as it often say, but until victory, because the objective is victory. We in Europe will never know freedom and peace. I mean, the necessary condition for that is Ukrainian victory. Briefly on your question on the Accelerator Act, I mean, we need to find an equilibrium between the interests of the producers and the consumers, and that equilibrium is around 75% of local content, give or take. We need to discuss that depending on the tech we're talking about. Obviously, on solar PV modules, it won't be 75. On solar PV inverters, it might be 100%. But that's the way, at least, we are approaching that with the Social Democrats. We're very much in favor of that Made in Europe approach, on that European preference approach, which I think is vital to stop with the naivety of the 1980s. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, Francis Fukuyama was wrong. We're not living through the end of history. We need to make sure that DigiTrade also understands that. By the way, that's made in Europe, not in Mexico, to be clear. Final point on the politics of the climate transition. Let me quote the French Prime Minister. I mean the political opposition in France, just to be clear. And the French Prime Minister is, ideologically is coming from the EPP. And he said a couple of days ago that our climate interest and our geopolitical interest are aligned. He's right. I'm happy. I mean, it took us since 1973, so it took us 53 years to get there, but finally, we are here. We understand that our climate interest and our geopolitical interest are aligned. So what I'm trying to do as a positive case is to say that, like, I want people, when they see a windmill, to feel patriotic further. If you're a true patriot, like I am, you should feel patriotism whenever you're seeing when you're seeing a windmill, because that's actually the tangible translation of loving your country. If you do love your country, you want to do many things. You want your country to be free. That also means producing energy inside your country, homegrown energy. Wind power is just one example there. What we've been lacking, however, is a social justice agenda. It's difficult to push it forward because the Commission has been controlled by the center-right since, let me rephrase that. The last time a social democrat was leading the Commission, do you remember when it was? Which year? Jacques Delors, 1994. So the last time we had a social democratic commission, I was 4.5 years old. Yeah. So we've been living through 30 years of Renew and EPP center-right policies. I mean, a lot of progress was done, don't get me wrong, like Jean-Claude Juncker, Energiewende, and all of that. But the social justice agenda was kind of put on the side. What I want is a European social leasing scheme for battery electric cars for the working men and women of our continent. Last Thursday, I was talking with Alexandra. She's a caretaker, so she goes to the home of different people in my hometown of Caen to provide them with the kind of help that they need. So we're talking about sick people, we're talking about very elderly people. She drives around 100 kilometers per day. 10 kilometers to go to see the first client, 20 kilometers here and that. She cannot do anything except using a car for that. She earns slightly above minimum wage, so around 1,500 euros per month. She cannot buy a new car, even a petrol car, just she cannot buy a new car. And now she will spend 20, 30 euros a month more for oil because Trump and Khamenei are doing crazy stuff in the Middle East. Can she afford that? For a month, maybe. Not more. What will she have to do? Sometimes she will have to stop working because the cost of the petrol will be higher than the money she will get by doing a 30 minutes or 60 minutes job. What will social leasing be for her? She would have directly access to a small electric car made in Europe. She would have to pay a lease for that of around 100 euros per month. And I made the math for her and the millions of caretakers, well, the 800,000 caretakers that we have in France. If you go from a battery electric car to a nice car, if you go from an internal combustion engine car to a battery electric car, and you drive around 75 kilometers per day, at the end of the year, you save around 2,000 euros per year.
Yeah, and I think
So
that the math around shifting to EVs is definitely moving in favor of that, given the spike we're observing now.
But so far, we've been using public money to give to the rich people who can buy new cars.
Yeah, so I think better targeting of this type of incentive measure is absolutely critical, particularly at a time of tight public budgets. So definitely agree with that. Let me try and also deep dive a bit more on you started discussing consumer engagement, right, through the transport side. We had one of the questions that was basically looking at also what are the risks and opportunities, and I would add barriers of trying to encourage the installation of decentralized renewables, meaning solar panels, more clearly. So how can that work? Why don't I involve Paula first and then Adrian on this point? Paula, how to integrate a plethora of solar panels and how to actually remove the barriers that are there, because Adrian was telling us it's very simple to set up a solar panel. There are a number of hurdles there, so what's the policy angle there?
I think here is, I wanted to come first back to the question on the positive case, if I may, that was asked earlier, and the issue of the possible backlash. So I think there one very positive element that we have mentioned is that we see that really member states that have more low carbon electricity, that have more renewables, or if they choose more nuclear, then prices are lower. And that, to me, is a very concrete example of how the policies that we have had already in the previous mandate and that we continue to implement are really going in the right direction, because that really connects to the citizens and also to the industrial consumers. So that's one element that I would like to mention there. And then as regards, let's say, the citizens benefiting from all these solutions, the rollout, I think here, the barriers that I was mentioning before are really quite important. In the case of solar, of course, prices have gone down. So that's already a different situation as compared to some other technologies. And there what we see is still barriers on permitting that we are really trying to address. So even in the grids package, we have specific provisions still for solar so that they can really be rolled out, in particular for cases of self-consumption, with much less administrative hassle than today. This is not known generally, but there are still many barriers in that regard, really admin barriers, and that we are trying to solve. Then there is also the element of the tariffs incentivizing this, and that's also something that, again, we have produced guidance, is really within reach. It doesn't require much more than implementing what is now in legislation, so that's also something that is quite important.
Meaning it's up to national governments or regulators.
Exactly, yeah. And then, of course, also with the grids package, we are also trying to progress on the grid side. We also produce guidance on grid connections, which is an element that is also relevant. So we are really trying to tackle from all the different angles.
Okay, thank you. Adrian, did you want to follow up? And then I might come. Feel free if you want to touch upon the bidding zones. Otherwise, I will pose that also to Frauke. Go ahead.
I mean, generally speaking, we've gotten really, really good at helping people put solar panels on their buildings. We've rolled out 190 gigawatts of solar in the last 3 years. They're 180, 190, something like that. And a lot of that is on rooftops. A lot of the barriers, I think, as Paula says, are more local level. Like, do you need to get a permis d'urbanisme, some sort of attestation from your local government to put them on? We don't need to do that. In France, if you're within 100 meters of a protected building, you need to get a special permit to, put solar panels on your building. They're small barriers, but they're definitely there. So we can get better. But we've seen the growth in solar on rooftops, and yeah, generally speaking, we're really, really good at it. We can get better. There's different vehicles as well, like energy communities, where you produce your own electricity and you share it within a defined group. That's really hard to do, it turns out. It's a lot of work, so that hasn't really taken off. And I think there's some efforts from the Commission to see why that is. Yeah, the citizens. And so there's more things to do, but honestly, we're in a really good place for citizens to be able to protect themselves. The business case is enough that if you have access to credit, you can take out a loan from your bank, put on the solar panels, and you'll save money every month, right? If it's a 10-year loan. Your solar panels will be paid off, and you'll save money every month. So that's a really, really good place to be. Very quickly on the politics of it, I would just say that electrification is very much about European energy. As Thomas was saying, it's a patriotism thing. This is about getting European energy into European homes and industry and transport. And on the bidding zones specifically, it really varies depending on where you're talking about. They've worked reasonably well in Sweden in that we've seen a lot more variability of pricing events. So, prices will go negative or positive, but they don't go very deep, right? Unlike the minus 400 megawatt hours this morning in Belgium and France and Germany, in Sweden, it's like -3, -4 euros, right? So that's a much more manageable, so they've worked well there. I would say that, like in Belgium, I don't think it makes any sense. Belgium is essentially copper-plated. There's no benefit for having locational bidding zones within Belgium. In Germany, is there potential? Yes. But is it the top priority? In my opinion, no. You need to get the smart meters out first. You need to get that dynamic tariffs. That's where I think the attention should be put for the next few years. Maybe Frauke disagrees. Maybe? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. But the estimates, so correct me if I'm wrong, the estimates I've seen in terms of what Germany could save by splitting into 5 bidding zones, including Luxembourg, is on the realm of 5 or 6 billion a year on their electricity spending, but which is less than 0.5%.
It's bigger.
It's bigger? Okay. Anyway, I would say that it's something that Germany should look at, but right now I think it should focus on getting smart meters out and building the domestic interconnections between North and South Germany. But hand it
Well,
over
I
to
don't disagree on the smart meter.
And I will challenge you on, and again, trying to explain, what's the
sorry, I didn't
bidding
do
zone
that,
split up. Yeah.
Okay, starting from there. So bidding zone, essentially, we took the German example. In Germany, the power price is the same across the country, whether you're north, south, wherever you are. In Sweden, you have different bidding zones where the price varies depending on where you are, reflecting essentially the availability of power and grid capacity in any particular area. Now, what does the German one bidding zone mean?
So it's very cheap in the north of Sweden and more
That's
expensive in
right.
the south.
It
And so
is.
the industry goes to the north.
Exactly. And in Germany, if you were to split the country, you would probably have a similar effect. A lot of wind power production in the north, a lot of industrial power demand in the south. So you would see prices on average go down in the north and go up in the south. Now, we have actually published, what was it, October last year? And I'm very happy to share that, a very detailed analysis, especially about the German case, because it's very political. And there we are seeing, oh no, it's getting even more nerdy, but billions every year of redispatching cost, which is essentially somebody in the north has sold power at a particular uniform price, but that power cannot be transmitted to the south where the demand is because the grid capacity is just not there. So the producer in the north who has bid into the market will get that money anyway because they sold it on the market, but it's not going to be effectively used. They will be curtailed, can't produce. Instead, a backup, often gas plant in the south, will be turned on to meet that demand. They will need to be paid at cost so that the consumer who has purchased the power at a particular market price will get that power. So that is what a single price zone does that does not reflect the reality of the power system. Now, it's a highly political debate, as you can imagine, because if you now said we split Germany into different bidding zones, we would see some, especially wind producers in the north, gain less revenues than they would have in the past. They built their investment on the case of one bidding zone. Whereas you would see some highly demanding industries on the south get a higher power price than they would have otherwise. What we've done is we've looked just over the last years, if Germany had had different bidding zones, what would it have meant for consumers? And unfortunately, I don't have the numbers present in my head. I would love to be able to quote them now. I can't. But what I can tell you is that what we found was that on average, power prices would go down for consumers quite significantly. And even in the south, because the average just reduction of not having to pay the redispatch cost for curtailing plants and then turning on backup means that in many areas of the German south even large consumers would still benefit. But there are particular areas, especially in the southwest, where they would pay more for power. And there are particular areas in the north where, especially wind, for solar the impact isn't that significant, but for wind they would earn less than they would have otherwise. But the savings through those bidding zones are so enormous that in principle a compensation mechanism could be built to make up for those price differences, and there would still be a lot of money left. So in theory, you could build a model that is perfectly making everything cheaper and nobody loses. But that, of course, would be a very big administrative construct, and then the question is, how long is it going to stay like this? So we appreciate it would be a process that is politically very sensitive and that takes time to introduce and needs to come with the necessary kind of buffering mechanisms to smoothen the impacts and come back to the predictability, the reliability that Tomai also emphasized, that we are so strong with in Europe and that we need to maintain. Is it something that needs to be addressed this year? Well, the government doesn't want to, so it's not going to happen. But it's good to already look at the substance of it. If you allow, Elisabetta, I would like to add a small point on the China question, but I don't know if we
Please do, and then I have a final question to get your final thoughts wrapping up. But
okay.
So very, very briefly, if possible.
All right. So on the China question, I think we need to there you are. We need to distinguish between, well, on the one hand, we have like large industries, steel, where also the Commission has done a lot, where we have oversupplied markets. So I'm not going to comment on that, but more on the electrification field, clean tech, where again, China has invested a lot. You started, Elisabetta, by saying that they are an electrification supplier. They also have more demand than us, but here I think it's very important to distinguish from a security perspective what our dependencies are. And we have proposed in our recent energy security paper a categorization of our dependencies and what we should focus on. And the first category is anything that is vital to the functioning of the power system. So power electronics, grid management, that is directly vital to steering our system, and where the cybersecurity risk is high. And this is where Europe should put its focus to make sure that we have European control. Fortunately, for most of it we do, but not for all. And that needs to be a priority to make sure that Europe manages anything that is vital to the operation of the system. Second category is materials and components that are important for the functioning of the European energy industry. So I'm talking battery-grade material for electric vehicles. I'm talking components for wind turbines, where basically if a certain supply is stopped or put under pressure, the whole industry would be in deep trouble. For those elements, the strategies are different, and it's not always that Europe needs direct control, but it does need diversification, in some cases strategic stockpiling, and a gradual increase of also European capabilities to make sure that we cannot be blackmailed on any of those elements. And then we have the third category, and that is essentially mass market products, where the risk of blackmail is very low, and where, frankly, if we have to prioritize from a security perspective, it would be a lot of money spent on something where we might as well benefit from cheap markets and cheap supplies to make the transition work, make it work fast, and make it work in the favor of European users.
Thank you very much. We started slightly late, so I'm going to just take 5 more minutes to just ask one final reflection from all of you, rapid fire, 1 minute. And the question is, where do you think Europe can land on this consumer-producer electrostate spectrum, so to speak? And what would be your top 1 policy urgent action that needs to be taken to advance on this electrification journey? Thomas, I'm going to necessarily start with you. 1 minute, quick fire thoughts with a policy, I guess, action agenda for great urgency.
Socialistic for battery electric cars.
Socialistic for battery electric cars.
Let me, something like this. 10 million battery electric cars available for you working class Europeans now and in the next 5 years. We do that, we save on oil, we literally save people from misery. You know, remember, the kindness between humans should be actually a basic value. More practically, we actually decrease the cost of electricity for everybody else. Why? Because we're talking about people who do not need charging points. You don't need to expand the grid. We're talking about people that will charge at home every night. We're talking about people who don't go on holidays in Deauville or Saint-Tropez or whatever. We're talking about the working people that are the backbone of our economy. What does it mean? It means that they're going to charge at home at a moment where they don't consume during the night. And therefore, you don't need an investment in DSO grid or even less TSO grid. So it means you increase electricity demand while keeping the grid cost the same overall, and therefore the grid cost is divided over a greater number of kilowatt hour. So social leasing is not only good for the purchasing power of the people that will benefit from it, it's good for the purchasing power of everybody else, because you can reduce the grid cost as a result of a social leasing policy.
Okay, so a focus on how to speed up the electrification on transport, but with a very focus on the households that would not be able to perhaps afford an EV otherwise, and keeping it a light load on the grid. Adrian, why don't I move to you? Consumer, producer, electrostate possibilities for Europe and how to make it happen.
Can I split the difference and say it's the real benefits are going to be European companies that do the electrification for others? Mm-hmm. So we've got Schneider and ABB and Siemens and a lot of other European know-how that are really, really good at transforming industrial processes and electrifying things. And the industrial heat pumps that they use are made in Europe, and they're not going to be subject to mass Chinese manufacturing threats. So we're already leading in that. We can lean into it to help our own business, and then we can export that knowledge abroad, because this sort of industrial electrification will go abroad, and we can lean into that strength.
Thank you very much for bringing in the industrial angle. Paula.
I'm afraid that in my case, I cannot pick just one. So in terms of the visions that you flesh out, I think we need a combination of the two. And then in terms of solutions, I don't think we can only look, at transport or at buildings or at industry or demand and not supply.
Priority number one.
I really think that priority number one is to combine the three, supply, the flexibility on the grids, and the demand.
Okay, difficult to choose if you didn't pick one priority, but of course you're highlighting the complexity of keeping, I think, the evolution of clean energy supply and flexible demand going more or less at the same time. Frauke, final words for you.
Adrian, I had expected you to focus on the price ratio. Instead, you went on the supply side, so then I'm going to take that.
Great.
No, getting the price ratio, electricity and fuels, right, and
meaning getting electricity more affordable than
making
the fossil
electricity
fuels?
relatively more affordable. You mentioned earlier, Paula, the still favorable taxation for fuels. We need to overcome that in order to have the market signals be right. And to make it more interesting, we are, again, in a moment of crisis. And in those moments, it's often tempting to talk about just general price caps. Let's make it easier by a flat price cap, and ideally even keep that beyond the crisis. That's going to make things worse. So it's really a question of, instead of having a general approach of capping prices for everyone, and by that getting essentially disorderly demand destruction, because that's what we'll get then in a moment of crisis. The question is one of more orderly demand destruction by targeted supporting investments into what's getting us out of gas quickly now, but also targeted support, and that will be needed, to industries who are suffering, but also to vulnerable consumers. So it's not a question about blunting markets and destroying signals. It's about maintaining signals, very importantly, and buffering the impacts for those who really need to be buffered in a strategic, structured approach to who suffers from demand destruction.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all my speakers. I think we went down some pretty technical rabbit holes, but hopefully also took away the big picture, which is that electrification is not just an energy policy issue, but it's an economic and industrial revolution as such, with huge geopolitical relevance, as I'm grateful also to our Ukrainian colleague to have reminded us the implications are huge. Thank you very much. Lunch is served, I believe, and I'll see you at the next session.